Along with a lot of people out there, when I chose to cast my ballot for Donald Trump, I did so partially because of the fact that I felt with Hillary Clinton in the presidency or any other Democrat controlling the executive branch, my First Amendment and Second Amendment rights would be at risk. I never thought for a second that 2 years after that very same election, I would be sitting here required to talk about defending my Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights instead, but here we are. I'm sure a lot of people know by now that the biggest news story going on right now is the confirmation hearing of Brett Kavanaugh and everything that stood in its way from the beginning of it. It's been one of the biggest news stories going on since July when Justice Kennedy, Kavanaugh's predecessor, retired from the Supreme Court. But this has been one of the most televised, most noted, and honestly, one of the most public Supreme Court hearings out there. Now, I'm sure that if you had a distinct interest in the Supreme Court and the judicial process, during all other Supreme Court nominations and confirmations, the information was always going to be out there for you to go out and watch the hearings and engage in it publicly. We have a government that's pretty transparent despite some people in its best attempts, and we have the ability to watch even on an unelected position. We don't have to sit back and hope that things go well in the background. Most of us choose to accept it in the background, but for the most part, we don't have to. But this one has been different. This has been covered by major networks, minor networks. It's been covered online. The viewership for the confirmation hearings has been huge, and I barely remember any sort of news story at all that surrounded the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, the previous Trump pick, even though theoretically that should have been the same kind of end of the world scenario. Even though it was very public, the confirmation hearings and the lead up to the confirmation vote went off essentially without a hitch, up until the vote was supposed to take place 2 weeks ago. Then at the last minute, congressional Democrats came out and launched their Hail Mary pass to try and keep this from happening and keep this from going through until after the midterms, as most commentators and most people in the Senate by now have come to agree was the motivation behind all of this. Brett Kavanaugh was accused by some people credibly, by others incredibly, of sexually assaulting a girl when he was in high school, 17, and she was 15. And of course, the court of Twitter and public opinion was already there, ready to convict him, deny him of his rights, and demand a full FBI investigation for this. And this is part of the problem that I have with this. This is what I want to talk about right now. This is a direct violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. I've talked about this numerous times as I've been covering the Kavanaugh story. It's those two amendments that I want to talk about because this is not the first time the court of public opinion, people in Congress, or people of the country have decided that we need to waive these rights for people against their will. I want to start with the Fourth, because that seems to be the most relevant to what's going on in the news right now with the FBI investigation that's being demanded by people on both parties in Congress and the president. Let's read the text of this amendment. The full text of the Fourth Amendment reads as follows: The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That first line, the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, that's one of the big ones that's going through the news right now. Senate Democrats and some Senate Republicans, along with the court of Twitter, have asked that Kavanaugh himself go through and demand the investigation because the FBI went through and essentially laughed in their faces when they went and requested it themselves. By that logic, not only are they expecting Kavanaugh to be subject to an unreasonable search and a seizure, they're actually asking him to ask for that without a warrant because the court will not grant a warrant to have the search and seizure. But there's another part of this that really bothers me when they're thinking about this. Now, let's take the time frame out of the picture and just look at the area frame of this. Dr. Ford has come forward and said that she doesn't know the date, time, or place that the sexual assault happened. She just knows that it was near Columbia Country Club in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Now, if we look at this map here that I'm presenting to you right now, you will see the fact that there are several subdivisions that surround the country club. Prosecutors and Senate Judiciary members have narrowed down to one subdivision where this might have happened, but that would mean that you would have to sit back and search all of the houses in that particular area, and that is another violation of the Fourth Amendment. The last line, particularly describing the places to be searched, that's part of the problem that we need to address when we're talking about the investigation. It could have been any number of the houses in this area, and in order to get a warrant for the FBI to investigate for 35-year-old evidence to this case, they would need to go through and search every single house in the area because there's nobody out there that can particularly describe which house, which room needs to be searched. Another violation of unreasonable search and seizure. Now, most of the people in the court of Twitter do expect the FBI to go through and tear apart every one of these houses one by one until they find the specific evidence that shows that a drunken 17-year-old tried to rip the clothes off a 15-year-old girl. But that is completely unreasonable, not only for Kavanaugh and Ford, but for the owners of every single one of these houses out there, many of these houses which may have changed hands 3 or 4 times in 35 years. This is a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and we shouldn't be standing for any of this, because, as I've mentioned before, if the Senate can do this to Kavanaugh, they can do this to any of us. Many of us don't have the political and legal clout of Kavanaugh, so we can't stand up for ourselves, especially if they go through and start demanding that we waive other rights, rights like the Fifth and everything that is held herein. Let's look at the text of that amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in the cases arising in the land or naval forces, or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense twice, put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but it's something that's very important that we need to understand when we think about the ongoing case that's going against Judge Kavanaugh for his Supreme Court justice future, as well as thinking about the cases of Judge Roy Moore and the ongoing investigation that's going into our president over the Russian collusion and any other capital crimes that somebody wants to try and hang on him. Now, in the case of Kavanaugh, Senator Harris was able to sidestep a lot of this by coming out and saying that this isn't a criminal hearing, which by all rights it isn't. But there are a lot of differences to that, and I don't necessarily agree with her assumption that it isn't. And this is exacerbated by the fact that there are many people in the media, alternative media, and social media that are treating this like a criminal proceeding and would give the same results to a criminal proceeding. One of the parallels that I draw between this and a criminal proceeding is the fact that should this not go Kavanaugh's way, that means that he will be denied his ability to exercise a constitutional privilege, and the president will be denied his ability to exercise his constitutional right to appoint a justice to fill the vacancy on the court. Now, obviously, there's not going to be any prison time that comes away from this hearing or any other sort of criminal punishment that comes away from it, but just the denial of a constitutional right based on a hearing that's not a criminal hearing, that has had no grand jury indictment and has had no real investigation that would result from such grand jury indictment. That's wrong in my eyes. As far as I can tell, Kavanaugh is being denied his right to liberty as laid out in the Constitution and the articles of the Constitution that govern the Supreme Court based on a trial that has not had an indictment. Along this entire situation, I've always said the same thing. If Kavanaugh actually did this, I will be the first person there to prosecute him and exercise the punishment that is appropriate to the crime in which he committed. But before I can go out and hang a man for a crime, I do need you to bring me an indictment, and he needs to be tried by a jury of his peers. I can't just hang an innocent man because some senators and some people on social media told me to. I need to actually have him go through the process and be able to defend himself. And that's what this amendment says, and that's what this amendment is going for. This is exactly the same as the Roy Moore case, and I said essentially the same thing. Roy Moore was essentially tried in the court of public opinion. Opinions went around on him on social media, including many people who thought that he should be burned at the stake for what he did back in the 70s and 80s and beyond. And honestly, he should have had an indictment if people did want to punish him. But the social media trial did do its job. Roy Moore was denied his chance to sit on the Senate and fashion the law as he saw fit, and all of the women, all of the allegations, and any chance at an indictment went away immediately as soon as that election was over. I'm sure that had Moore been tried for the crimes that he was alleged to have committed, then there would have been a lot more news coverage about that. But, as I said, as soon as that election was over, that entire story completely dropped off the news cycle. And that's a lot of what I predict would happen the same way. If the Senate denies the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh based on the allegations that have been brought forward and the hearings that were brought in place in order for him to testify and for Dr. Ford to testify, then after all of this is over, I guarantee that Ford is not going to press charges and ask for a grand jury indictment. I'll eat my words right now if I was wrong about this months later, but that seems to be the pattern that goes along around these sorts of things. And this goes all the way back up to the president, long before Kavanaugh was even selected by our president to be the next Supreme Court justice. Many people on social media were out there saying that Trump had no right himself to choose a new Supreme Court nominee, as he was under federal investigation at the time. What this means is that the court of social media believes that Trump should be denied his constitutional rights, responsibilities, and privileges based on an investigation without an impeachment, which is the presidential and elected official equivalent to an indictment by a grand jury. And that would go the same for Kavanaugh if he would be confirmed by the Senate and placed into the Supreme Court. Should he be confirmed, and it turned out that he actually committed these crimes, the House of Representatives would bring forward the articles of impeachment, and there would be an investigation by the articles of impeachment into the crimes that he was alleged to have committed. At the conclusion of the investigation, there would be a trial in the Senate by the senators, with the vice president presiding as the judge, at which point there would need to be a 2/3 vote if he would be convicted by the Senate to have him removed from office, and that is a 2/3 vote across both houses of Congress. There are procedures out there if he actually did this. But asking him to submit life, limb, and liberty for a crime that they can't confirm that he committed without a grand jury indictment is not the process. We have these protections in place for a reason. We came from an English monarchical society where just saying something bad about the king could leave you in a position where you could be beheaded or put to death in some other horrific way if you weren't tortured before that. We didn't want the government to have the final say as to who was guilty and who was innocent, or at least our founders didn't. Our founders believed that we needed to be tried by people like us, and that's why they put the Fifth Amendment into the Constitution. It was to protect us from the government. I continue to say the same thing over and over again because it's something that people need to hear and need to understand. This hearing is symbolic, and its outcome will affect all of us for the rest of time, and it's not about whether or not Kavanaugh gets on the Supreme Court. He wasn't really my first choice for Supreme Court justice. I would have rather seen Barrett. But now that he's up there and it's this close, it has become one of the most important choices for our Senate and for our American people in order to protect us from an overbearing government, which our Constitution was put in place to do. I had a meet the family moment last night. I've been seeing a girl and I was given the opportunity to meet her entire family last night. Her grandfather looked at me and asked me initially, after he found out that I put on this show twice a week, where my allegiances lie. I had one answer for him, and it's an answer that I hold true, and that is based on everything that I said in this video. My allegiance lies to the Constitution of the United States and its protections against her people. Nowhere else. I have no fealty definitively to either political party. But I'll say this right now. Over the last couple of elections, it has been common knowledge that many people who stand on the left have said over and over again that it might be time to look at the Constitution again and possibly throw it in the garbage because it's been in place for 240 years. And that's what's made me nervous. Since 1791, that document and the words contained within that document have protected the people of this country from a government that was growing too large and too overbearing, in which it would enslave its citizenry. And it's been and protected the people as I've watched the government of this country grow larger and larger and become more ambitious to take over the lives and enslave people, or at least be a big brother or a nanny state for them. The Constitution was put in place to prevent that from happening. It may seem exaggerated right now, but our liberty and our ability to preserve our own liberty from an overbearing government are on the line right now. There are those who would like to see it eroded, and those are some of the people out there, especially in the public, who may benefit from the fact that our liberty or the liberty of other people may be removed from them for no reason other than wrongthink. I leave you with this. Absolute power absolutely corrupts, and there was a document that was brought forward by our founders to prevent that. Not the Magna Carta, not any other constitution or governing document in this world has protected people from their government more than our Constitution has at this point. I will do everything that I can, everything in my power, including making these videos twice a week for as long as I can, to make sure that the Constitution stays in place and the general public continues to be protected from the government. Because a government that is big enough to give you everything is big enough to take everything away from you. What do you think of these hearings, the way that they're structured, and what do they mean to you? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comments section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlogTwitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care, everyone.